So I'm joined today by Teresa Carlson, the President and Chief Commercial Officer from Flexport, John Sicard, the President and CEO of Kinaxis, and Pervinder Johar, the CEO and President of Blume Global, to talk about tech and supply chain and all the ways that digitization is driving value across supply chain operations and really being transformative for the planet. Very excited to have you all here today. Kind of jealous of some of the glasses and the fashion that's being served. But why don't we start just getting a little bit of your perspective about that question of the day, tech, digitization, and supply chain. What's your perspective on it and how you see your role playing? I'm just going to go across the couch as we are and come to you, Teresa, first.
Well, first of all, it's so great to be on here with my panel members. I am Teresa Carlson. I'm the President and Chief Commercial Officer at Flexport, and we are a global supply chain and trade company, and we are really trying to bring just that technology, digitization to this world, to work backwards from our customers and understand what they're trying to achieve and bring visibility to what they're doing. Because it's one thing to have it for yourself, but it's another thing to make sure that the customer really has that visibility. I call it a common operating picture where things are moving around the world, and it's important. And I'm excited, and I also believe we can bring a platform for small and medium businesses and make sure that they don't always use the most expensive route and that they have visibility as well. So really it's access for all. I run flexport.org as well, and we are looking at climate. We are trying to get supplies into places around the world that really need them. We just sent things to Turkey and Syria. It's a really interesting topic, how important it is for the supply chain, and that there's a big transformation happening right now that, customers, individuals, they want visibility. They want to understand what's going on. And my background is really in technology, 25 years as a technology executive, and being able to apply technology to supply chain and logistics, I think, is just critical. And we saw what happened during COVID. So from my perspective, the tools are out there. There's availability in what can occur through the technology and digitization. We just now have to make that a reality. And I see a group of leaders here at Zero100 really trying to move the ball forward and being the leaders in not only driving digitization, but making sure that we're also thinking about the climate as we do that. And I can tell you the one thing that matters is integration, the ability to take advantage of what you have in terms of data, make real use of that, and merge that information. So I think the technology itself is not the barrier, it's the moving it forward through the people, the process, the leadership, then to make it happen.
Yeah, 100%. I think there's no shortage of community in supply chain anymore, but I think what's been really cool at this event and being able to speak to the three of you is technology service providers, solution providers really being an instrumental part of that integration that you're talking about and how we move things forward. It feels like a community of people who are really trying to solve.
Yeah.
But yeah, let me come over to you, John, and hear a little bit about your perspective on this topic.
Yeah, I think I've come to appreciate a couple of things. First, I'm a technologist by trade. I'm a software engineer by training. I've always thought about technology first. And over the last 2 years, I've come to realize that all the pain that we're experiencing is not a failure in technology, actually. It's a failure in technique. Similar to what you were saying about an operating model. We're living through this, what I might even call a renaissance a bit here.
A renaissance.
A renaissance.
Yeah, there you go.
I'll use my French.
Can you use your Canadian accent?
Yes, renaissance. But seriously, we're seeing two things happen. One, we had this event occur. It literally affected every human on Earth simultaneously. It's not unlike, there's a lot of catastrophes that we have to experience or disruptions. Everyone suffered the same kind of challenge from a business perspective. And simultaneously, boards are taking responsibility for ESG. So these two narratives are colliding. One narrative is saying, yeah, clearly we have to be more resilient. And if you think of the definition of resilience, it's the capacity to avoid or recover from hardship. And obviously, we've encountered a lot of hardship in the last 2 years. At the same time, I can't think of another discipline that consumes the Earth's natural resources at a greater pace than supply chain. And so boards are saying, you need to become more resilient, but can you do less harm at the same time? Well, those two things are competing against each other because we saw a lot of hoarding going on. I'm going to absorb flexibility by carrying more inventory. That's a taxation on the planet. And so these two things are happening simultaneously. And at Kinaxis, we think about it in those terms first. Techniques inform technologies. Otherwise, you can just end up having a lot of conversations about interesting technology, but not necessarily valuable technology. So I think part of what we're seeing here in this rebirth of supply chain as a governance model, if I can use that term, people are now thinking about not the next 3 years, the next 30.
For sure.
They're looking at it as, what will I leave behind for the next generation? Because we're pivoting. We're at
And
a
making
pivotal
themselves publicly accountable for that as well.
100%.
Yeah.
It's fascinating to see more than ever chief supply chain officers, supply chain practitioners no longer being seen as quote unquote operators. They're strategists. They're at the table with the board talking about how they're going to build resilience while simultaneously doing less harm.
Yep. The new role of the chief supply chain officer, the COO, is actually looking down the line at the camera at CNN. That didn't exist 5-10 years ago. And
That's
so
right.
responsibility for the planet, but also responsibility for corporate brand, reputation, trust. And that's a whole new ballgame for supply chain as a profession. So I'd love to hear you bring that up. Pervinder, why don't I come to you and hear your perspective on this?
Sure. I think for me, like John, also a software engineer. So long time in tech, kind of for all my life in tech. So it's been, I won't say the number of years anymore, John. I'm CEO for Blume. We founded Blume in 2018 to look at kind of three fundamental problems, and they're kind of related. And I think COVID brought them to the forefront. And one of them was that we had a very large mass of businesses which were just left behind. And so people were talking about making their digital supply chain digital, but the reality is that there are close to 100 million small businesses who do not have access to the smallest amount of technology in the world. So when you talk about the social responsibility and other component, that was the one fundamental problem we've been solving by giving technology for free to these small motor carriers in Thailand and in China and in Taiwan or in US too, because that was a fundamental problem that if you can't talk about a supply chain being digital without looking at everyone and making technology available to every business in the world. And we said we're building a platform for next 50 years. I think we're still 20 years away till kind of the people have similar to how now they have cell phones as individuals, how they can go on Instagram and Facebook and others, no matter what part of the world you are in. But that doesn't exist in supply chain today. Large companies have money to invest, small companies don't. That's the one side that we can't forget on our responsibility side of it. And the second part, we still talk about software in supply chain. I think software is probably going to be dead over the next kind of 20 to 30 years. Like the world has moved to the platforms and ecosystems. And then, Teresa, your point about integration, that you're living in the age, at least on the consumer side, that it's no longer about what piece of software you have. It's what's the ecosystem and how do multiple ecosystems collaborate with each other. Think of something very simple that we built, and it took a fair amount of time, that if you wanted to go somewhere and find out where is every rail ramp in the US, you can't find it. We built this thing called Blume Maps, but you can talk about that. You want to move goods on rail versus kind of truck. Math is simple. Anything that moves on rail is more carbon efficient than anything that moves on truck. Mm-hmm. But we still have that only 4-5% of the goods, even the companies who are here, move on rail in North America versus on truck, which a single train can have up to 160 double stack containers. So moving it equivalent of a 320 trucks. Yeah. But that platform did not exist. That how do I even know what is available? So I think for me, if we live in this very duality, I live in San Francisco Bay Area, used to work for one of the largest tech companies, actually the largest tech company at that time. A lot of innovation going on. We were talking about ChatGPT. We invested in ChatGPT. I was involved back in early days of it on one side. And on the other side, you're living in a world on supply chain side where small businesses don't have technology. We can't figure out where our ports are, where our terminals are, where the others are. And I think next few years, it is going to be fair amount of transformation for this duality to kind of almost opposite side of the spectrum, right? So if you're doing a ChatGPT conversation on one side, and on another side, you're saying that here's a driver who doesn't even have a mobile app, which can tell you that I picked up or dropped off a load in there are two very different words. I grew up in India. As you guys know, India has had a lot of rich age and a lot of poverty. Supply chain is no different. It seems like that we have a lot of rich age and a lot of poverty from technology perspective. And then we are relying on all of those components to work together.
Pervinder, something that you bring up for me is the democratization of supply chain and how that gets applied across businesses. The focus on how tech enables that, how visibility can drive that, is making supply chain not just a big global Fortune 500 conversation. It's something that's happening everywhere. And I think with that in mind, what I'd love to explore with the panel, I'm going to put a question out there and you can jump in if you want. If you had a magic wand for supply chain, like you could just make anything happen overnight, what would you do? And mine is every time I touch something that like is a physical good, I wish I could like transport into the factory and watch the person who's actually making that. It's not very practical, but I'm just always curious how it happens.
I would say more from a right now practical sense. I do think for me, having the capability for small businesses to really be able to have the same access as very large enterprises and global companies to get their supplies where they need them to be, and in a way that it helps them be a lot more profitable. Yeah. And I know they are concerned, so many are concerned about the climate, so we need to be able to take what we do I was at Amazon for a very long time, what we were able to do there, and make sure that every small business really has that capacity, because we are powered as a world by small businesses. Even if you look at all the large businesses that exist, even through their small resellers or chains of individuals that help them with product components. So I think for me, that's where I'd like to see us go faster. But the beam me up thing is definitely where my mind is headed.
John, Pervinder, any thoughts?
When I think about legacy, you use that term, and I think about it too. I think, well, what have we done while we're here? Yeah. We're here for such a short time. Yeah. And I like the term democratize, because I think the world of supply chain has been so almost reserved for the large, mighty, built on the premise that every supply chain is so unique that we're going to customize the solution just for you, and it was unaffordable. When I think about supply chain, I think of a couple of things. One, I think it's the oldest discipline in the world. It started when humanity began. It was a trade of a sharp stick for maybe a handful of food. Somebody had to source the stick, sharpen it. Somebody forged the food.
The Dutch Indies Company. Yeah. You think about the trade. It's the trade that's been forever, right?
Forever.
It's what we all did.
Started, and I really appreciate that notion that supply chain makes the world go round, and it's mostly not the global 500. So I think if I had a magic wand, we would start to see even the smallest manufacturer harness exactly the same potential and expertise and digitization as the largest company in the world. Cloud's helping with that. It's not like, to get started, I have to buy a $200,000 piece of iron. No, I can just log in and gain access to the same intellect, if you will. It does, though, presume that supply chain is ubiquitous. And that's a huge leap for many people. I always think of supply chain as this simple formula. There's volatile supply and or demand for things that are constrained. I don't care if there's 100 billion things or 10. I would love to see the largest companies in the world sharing exactly the same intellect, the same capabilities, ubiquitize the intellect and the power so that even the smallest manufacturers could participate. Because in the end, we all win. As I said, it's all about supply chains are in service of humanity while simultaneously, actually at the generosity of Mother Earth. So if you do it well, humanity thanks you, but so does Mother Earth. And that's where I would love to see the world going.
The conversation that we're having right now is interesting because we have a big mix of people. We have people not in supply chain, we have startup entrepreneurs, and then we do have our community of the global Fortune 500. One of the biggest things they're trying to solve right now is Scope 3. And in order to solve Scope 3 decarbonization on the supply side, it has to be this partnership with an entire ecosystem, which is going to bring you into an ecosystem of suppliers who are small businesses. And how do you get uniform around the targets, the metrics, the measurement systems? All of that is a really hard problem. And so when people talk about Scope 3, this idea of democratization of information and how that drives collaboration, it's the only way to make that happen. So spot on. Pervinder, what's your magic wand?
I think one thing that I wish could happen, we have moved to a world on our personal life again. where we are all subscriber of data and provider of data. Think of Google Maps. The only reason it works that each one of us share our location when we are driving, and then others get it. In supply chain, if I had a magic wand, it will be that kind of all the large supply chains, to your point, stop hoarding the data and start sharing the data with each other. And I think that's a mindset and a leadership issue more than a technology issue. And that mindset change is probably the hardest change to come about, involving everyone in the ecosystem, whether it's dealing with kind of democratization of technology, scope 3, every one of those things requires us to get away from this mentality that the larger companies have the data which is of value to them, and somehow that will be the differentiator for them. That data that you own is useless to you. You're only interested in other people's data, right? But it is telling you, you already know. You might get to know it a little bit better by applying AI and machine learning and other, but you already know it's your data. Why are you keep on looking at your own house, trying to see how do I improve it? If you've never looked at any other house, you don't know what else exists. So that's my magic wand, is start sharing data. And I don't know how I can make it happen or you can make it happen, but that's a mindset and a leadership issue.
It's funny listening to this too. If I could say, one of the things that has come to mind, I shared, I'm newer to the supply chain and logistics world. And one of the things that's also kind of struck me being new to it is I think it's too overly complicated. I actually think there's so many ways we can simplify it. Yeah. I watched the bid season process. Like, it seems much more complicated than it should be. And to your point, when you talk about technology in a cloud world, I wasn't there in the early days before people really understood cloud. I built the AWS Worldwide Public Sector business, and folks didn't know. I'd go to Capitol Hill and they would say, "Are you here to talk about books or taxes?" And I would say, "No, cloud computing." And they're like, "What's cloud?" Yeah. We've got to get folks on a path of, this is not that complicated. We're making it a lot more complicated than it is. Let's really use the technology for information, for data, and let's share it, and let's get these things moved. Let's understand, I'll go back to the visualization, all the technologies we have today. AI, machine learning, so possible if we share this information and data, and then we start understanding where and how are things moving, where are the clog points. I'm very hopeful when I think of how far technology's come, and we just got to now get individuals applying it here and kind of think more innovatively and transform their ideas of how they make decisions on getting goods to places.
I think it's so spot on. Pervinder and John were in our board meeting yesterday, along with Dave Clark from Flexport as well. And we were having a conversation about talent and skills and what's happening in supply chain. And Teresa, as you know, Dave sort of leans forward and kind of quietly says a joke that's genius on the side. Yeah. And what he said is, the chief supply chain officer 10 to 15 years in the future doesn't look like me. And he was talking about sort of the technology, AI, communications, and like the world of supply chain is about to go through a massive transformation of the skill sets. And so I can't think of a better group than you three to perhaps reflect. What's the one skill or sets of skills that you think are like most important for the profession today, for supply chain to be thinking, how do we get into that tech mindset?
We're getting to a point where systems are moving to be decision-making system from decision support systems. So typically the chief supply chain officer or supply chain skills have been, I will look at the information, but there's a human element that I will make the decision. And more of those decisions are going to get automated as you look at AI and machine learning, right? So understanding that sometimes you won't understand every single thing that's going on in your supply chain is a hard skill to come by. So another word is be comfortable with being uncomfortable about that what's going on in my supply chain, what the systems are doing. They may be doing something that I don't understand, but it is okay, right? Yeah. And then that skill, kind of again, if as technologist, you learn that you don't understand every single thing that happens when you apply reinforcement learning or when you apply kind of some of these stochastic models, because we all look at local optima, and then the system may be looking at a global optima, which is hard to understand. And that's a big leap, because today, chief supply chain officers and supply chain wants to understand what exactly is going on, see the data, and then make the decision.
Yeah, I think very, very much the same way. We're definitely going to see a change. But at the same time, there was recently a dialogue that people would say, oh, there's no longer going to be specialists. Mm-hmm. We're going to have network planners. And they're going to... I actually have stopped believing that. There was a time I thought, well, that's intriguing. And then I thought, I think supply chain is still a team sport. There's somebody who's really good at net minding, and they practice that skill. Now, teams win. Individuals don't. I mean, I always say this, I'm a hockey fan, Canadian, so I always say every sport would
like
be great.
required.
It was more like hockey.
Capitals, Washington Capitals.
Yeah, so no one should celebrate a hat trick when you lose 4-3. And yet, supply chains have been governed that way, where we hit our inventory numbers on time and full, not so much. No. So the team's losing, but individuals are winning. One of the side effects of the governance model that's been in place. Now, in the future, you talked about machine learning and AI. By the way, it's just software. It's not magic and pixie dust. Humans write it. Powerful, but has its limitations. I do think we're going to start to see machine learning and AI being used to automate the obvious, so that human beings don't have to do obvious things. Because it's a time waste to do obvious things. And if you're busy transacting obvious things, you're not actually working on things that are not so obvious. And so the skill set, Matt, that I see is you're going to start to see people who emerge in supply chain that have an appreciation for data patterns. And that's not so much like transactions. Transactions are easy. I read a screen, it says, go pull this, cancel this, split this order. Okay, I'm doing what I'm told. I think the future practitioners will still be specialists, but they're going to learn how to absorb data patterns for all of those conditions which are not so obvious. The other key I think we're going to start seeing is that people will start to play more like a team. And so instead of having opaque walls between all the quote-unquote silos, even if you have walls, they'll be made of glass, if you have walls at all. And so you'll have a lot more collaboration between teammates. You'll have empathy between teammates. Like, if I do this, it's good for me, but maybe bad for Teresa. So maybe we've not met, but I'm going to call Teresa because we recognize that I can't celebrate if the team loses. And that is going to, I think, a new competence that's going to emerge.
Yeah, it's the age-old squeezing the balloon, right? It's like supply chain's responsibility to stop doing that.
That's right.
I think, number one, we need individuals, believe it or not, who can talk to lawmakers and policymakers. And I think that it's so important that we actually communicate what we're trying to do in a new way to lawmakers too, because we've got to get ahead of their thinking on making laws and regulating things. So let me just say that, and I don't think we're probably doing enough of that. The second thing is I think we do need more software engineers that are applying their mind to the particular problems we face in this industry. And one of the things I loved about my role in technology and cloud is technology's been around for a very long time, right? We talk about tech. But the one thing I realized is if I couldn't get people trained and certified in cloud computing, no one was going to use it. But the other thing that I've been thinking a lot about for this industry that I think could be important is that in a selling capacity, like if you talk about somebody who's going and having sales skills, because believe it or not, people who understand how to sell something is not easy to find anymore. That's almost an industry like finding great sales individuals, because sales is not for the faint of heart anymore. You have to understand technology and you have to understand the model. I think in the sales world for supply chain and logistics, we have to move to individuals who understand technology now. So I'm seeing that with us. Like, I'm trying to find these individuals that can have both. And the last thing I'll say about skills is I love what we saw in the early session this morning, which kind of took the 8 and talked about all the different areas. And I thought that was really super cool. And it showed a lot of different skills that I thought would be meaningful. But the one that I personally got on board with so much was bringing the blue collar to the white collar. And there's so many skills I don't think you need to go to university for anymore. I think that we could teach a lot of these skills that we need. We should all put our heads together, create a small training, make it free, and then just have a hiring, like the tender of hiring. And I think that could help us also move the market along much faster if we're not worried about, do you actually qualify for this? Show up. If you pass it, let's go. Let's giddy up.
Yeah, I love that as a closing thought, as well as perhaps the whole radical reinvention on tech and digitization of ops comes from skills and like new ways to think about it, creating those career paths. Absolutely an interesting thought. So it was really great being here with Blume Global, Kinaxis, Flexport. I want to thank you for some really interesting perspectives about how we move this forward. So John, Pervinder, Teresa, thank you much for the time.
It's great.
Thank you. Thank you.
This episode of Radical Reinvention was produced by Brian Egan, Ursuline Khan, Mike Silverman, Diane Hope, Nick Heineman, Duda Rodriguez, and me, Victoria Marin. Ko Takasugi Chernovin composed our theme music. To find out more about Zero100 and to check out our content library, go to zero100.com. If you're interested in joining our community of contributors, send us a note at hello@zero100.com.